Let's go to our 2 o'clock guest every Friday at 2 o'clock. I have Dr. Bridge Bomby on now. Who is Dr. Bridge Bomby? One of the premier cardiologists in town. He's with Centric Health, one of the officers and owners over there. He comes on, and during this pandemic, he's been so resourceful and important in helping us answer some of your questions about where is the truth on this, what is expected of us, and where do we think this thing is going. One of the topics I wanted to cover with Dr. Bomby today is the vaccinations, because you knew it. We have an election. We have a presidential election in November, and even the vaccinations are being politicized. People are saying, is Donald Trump trying to rush through a vaccine as his October surprise? Will the vaccine be truly vetted? Will it be effective? All those questions, are we doing it the right way? Normally these vaccines take years to produce. Are we going to have a good one as we push this thing forward? There's lots on the table given the pandemic, and we had 8 more deaths today. So there we go. We got Dr. Bridge Bomby with us. Dr. Bomby, how are you on this Friday?
Richard, I'm well. How are you?
Doing terrific. Just doing terrific. And boy, this weather has been terrific. Tell me, can you help us here, or help me on these vaccines? Can the American public rest assured that we're not rushing this thing so fast that when they tell us that we have a process that would normally take much longer, that we're trying to fast forward this thing? Has this been done before? What assurance are we gonna have that this vaccine, or do you even know on a vaccine? And what kind of trials are held for a vaccine to make sure it is effective?
It's a long question, multiple subsets to it. First of all, the vaccine development, for the first time, it's multidimensional. There is a pharma involvement, there's a federal government involvement, and there is science involvement. It's necessary to begin with, all the milestones that were supposed to be hit on an accelerated time schedule are being hit with a convincing scientific authority that we will have a functional vaccine. What remains to be seen is if the process of vaccine development is allowed to be viewed by public, by scientific community across the board, and it's going to be transparent. Because the issue you raised, that everything is likely to be politicized in an election year, is real and relevant. Then I worry that even a good vaccine may end up like hydroxychloroquine with lipstick on it. Because that's the last thing we want. We don't want to have an excellent product which is tarnished because of political overtones to it. And from that perspective, I always felt that if there's a vaccine czar and vaccine ambassadors who are out there to cultivate or bridge the trust deficit that exists. Because now is the time to bridge the trust deficit. Because if we are unable to bridge the trust deficit and we have an excellent vaccine, we won't go far. What's happening now, Richard, is the bias, whether it's cognitive, whether it's political, whether it's tribal. All the facts fall on the fault lines that pre-exist. We don't move the conversation forward. My concern, actually a lot of the physicians I talk to, their concern is even a best vaccine can be undermined by lack of trust. And that's very important because there is a historical relevance to it. some of the audience may already know this. In the Second World War, around 1932 and afterwards, there was a Tuskegee airman, and there was an experimentation done in schools there about syphilis. So basically, the treatment of syphilis, which was penicillin at the time, was denied even after when it was available for the rest of the public. So the scars of experimentation and thus the acceptance of the vaccine by minorities, blacks especially, is going to be a challenge. The challenge I see is, so Richard, when you mentioned about the trials, there are two ways to conduct trials. One is the conventional way, in which you have two arms of the trial. One in which you give the medicine and see the effect, and the second, you give the placebo. So you compare the two sides. So in typical trial, you will have one subset of the people, like in Moderna, they have 30,000 people, which means 15,000 will have the vaccine, 15,000 will have placebo, and nobody will know the difference, not the doctor, not the patient. And then they're exposed to the elements, and in 3 months' time, hopefully enough will be affected by the virus on both sides of in both the arms, so that the data has statistical meaning to it. But the problem here is this. Most of the volunteers are young, white men. There isn't enough representation from the people you really need them to be in the trial for instance, the nursing home people, where the most mortality is concentrated, which means blacks and Latinos. So you will have data. If it's not well represented by the people who are suffering the most, then you will left to think, can we extrapolate the data from a relatively safer population to a relatively sicker population? So the challenges abound. A lot of times we are trying to make sure that we encourage the people who are reluctant to participate, but who need to participate through churches and other places to make sure that they go and participate in the trial. But the historical challenges, the legacy challenges, the hasten, the timeline that's necessary for the pandemic, not for the politics, but for the pandemic. We need to win this one because it's necessary to win this one. Election year happens to be in the middle. The other trial, which is how to speed up the process, is called a challenge trial. A challenge trial is when you give the person vaccine so that the antibodies develop and the immunity is created, and then you expose them to the pathogen. The trouble with that is the ethical model. How do you expose people to a virus which doesn't have a definite treatment? You could do that for instance, in people with malaria or cholera, but you can't do that with COVID because we really don't have an effective treatment. We can't guarantee that somebody isn't going to die through a challenge trial. So the challenge trial can expedite the timeline, but the risks and the ethics involved are very questionable there.
Wow. So we're not doing challenge trials. Is that what you're saying?
The Oxford team is doing challenge trial. They're working on an attenuated form of virus, and about 150 people are supposed to be involved in the trial. The trouble is, how do you know what dose of the virus is good enough, what dose of the virus is fatal? That's just a leap of faith.
Right.
But there's there is a 1 day sooner some organization which is bleeding heart people who care about people. So there are about 40,000 volunteers across 140 nations who want to participate in those trials. But the trouble is, for every trial, we have to have a informed consent. For us to have informed consent, we need to know what are the downstream adverse consequences of the disease. In the case of COVID, we don't even know that. So even when we have them sign the informed consent, we don't know what informed consent means. So that has, if not legal, at least moral and ethical issues.
Oh, wow. I mean, why is it when you talked about the predominant number of volunteers for some of these trials, you said that they're predominantly younger and male, and that other races or genders aren't properly represented? It seems to me, wouldn't it stand to reason that if you're going to run a trial, that you would want a representative sample of all age groups, that you would have the elderly represented, certainly women represented, certainly African Americans or Hispanic or Asians? That seems to me it would just be part of the process. Is that not happening?
Ideally, that's what the intent of the trial is, to have matching cohorts in both the arms, and it should be representative of the disease as it is in the community. And it's especially important for the people who have the most adverse consequences. They are included because you show the efficacy of an intervention most abundantly in people who are sicker. You show the efficacy in people who are much less sickness, requires a hugely larger sample size. When the severity of the sickness is higher, a smaller sample size will give you statistically significant information. The trouble isn't an outreach from the people who are conducting the trial. The trouble is the trust deficit that in a lot of the minority populations, there's a concern. It is experimentation. That we are being used as the historical burdens come into play.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I certainly understand that. Wow. Well, you mentioned starting off. You said that this process of trying to find a vaccine involves the government, involves big pharma, involves the scientific community, and then you overlay the November 3rd election and the political component, and you have a president who, for his own, to serve his own purposes for reelection, he would love to have a vaccine in October, so he could, people would go to the polls knowing that the Trump administration has done X. Is there any way to assure the public that of all these groups involved, that politics will not bring to market something that's not scientifically ready? Or is that it cannot that not be guaranteed?
I think what Justice Brandeis who said sunlight is the best detergent. I think you need to have all the data exposed to the experts who are bipartisan, who are scientists, who vet the data. So you have to have vetting of the data by the best minds who are impartial, who are only partial to the health of the nation, not partial to the politics of the nation. That would be critically important. If you're unable to do that, then you, as I suggested, you may have an excellent product, but not many takers for that, and that defeats the purpose. One of the ways you could demonstrate the efficacy and safety of the product is if it's well vetted scientifically is you have line up all the congressmen and senators and the president and let them be vaccinated on day one. That would send a message across the board in a bipartisan manner that, guys, if the leaders can take it collectively, let's not fight over it. Let's get the nation back to health.
Right. Oh man, you had mentioned last week or the week before, and I was you mentioned this, and I couldn't get it out of my head that that we should assume that, according to surveys, that up to 50%, I believe you said, like, it was like 30% of people are against vaccinations and another 20% aren't sure. So up to 50% of the population may opt out of the vaccine. Is that correct?
That is correct. So 49% said yes. 31% said we don't know, not sure. 20% said no. So even this data is also has the ethnic discrimination. So in African Americans, 50% say they will take the vaccine. In Caucasians, 75% they say they'll take the vaccination. So we need to bridge these gaps because at the end of the day, if you have the vaccine, but there are not enough takers, you don't build the herd immunity. You perpetuate that suspended animation that we are in. We're not moving forward. We're just in a zombie state. I think it's extremely important that we put our efforts into building the trust. And because we have systematically destroyed institutions, we have systematically destroyed belief in science and logic. We need to rebuild that, and we need to rebuild that quickly in a bipartisan manner.
Right, right. Thank you. We're talking to Dr. Bridge Bomby. Dr. Bomby, let's say it's even less than 50%. Let's say, just pick a number, 30%. 35% of Americans opt out of a vaccine. Either they don't trust it, they're anti-vaxxers, they're doing it for political reasons, or they just don't believe that, you talk about that trust deficit hasn't been bridged. How can this possibly be effective, a vaccination policy, when a third of the population says we're not going to join?
I don't think that would be that bad if you have 2/3 of the people who take the vaccine, because if you include the people who have been infected and somewhat safe, that may increase the numbers a little further up. And more the immunity, less the threat of spread of virus. So it would be a good thing if you have 2/3, but ideally, it should be universal. Ideally, we even should give incentives for people to be vaccinated. If you're going to give $25 gift card for them to be vaccinated, it should be done, because if vaccination is safe and effective, it's only imperative to the nation's physical health, economic health, that all of us take it. And if it needs to be repeated every year, we get it repeated every year, because this 2020, the smothering impact of 2020 on the psyche, on the morale, on the intelligence, the schools not working, kids careers getting devastated. This cannot continue. We need to get over it, get around it.
God, that's true. I love that. The smothering impact of 2020, it makes me feel almost claustrophobic. I think that's accurate. In any vaccine, given the history of vaccines, is there always going to be a percentage of people that either it's just not going to work, or it could inadvertently harm in some way?
Absolutely. So I think the bar for COVID vaccination is 50%. If it shows 50% efficacy, we call it a success. The second thing, which I have talked to a number of virologists and others, is a concern that people who already had the infection, asymptomatic infection, they don't know it, and they get the vaccine. Could there be a hypersensitive reaction? And we don't really have answers to that. So there are a lot of unknowns that will be answered as the time progresses. But the short answer is, if you have a effective, safe vaccine, we need to make it nearly compulsory for all of us. It should be social responsibility. It should be a governmental responsibility. It should be medical advice that guys all get vaccinated.
Could you see a time when the schools actually, I mean, I know this is a political question, when a time when the schools say, just as they do now, that you cannot enroll your child in school unless your vaccinations include a COVID vaccination?
That's a great question. I think it's worthy of thought, and makes eminent sense that the kid is protected, and other kids are protected too. I think that's a great suggestion, Richard.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, you talk about it, that's one way to make it compulsory if you really want to protect the schools, if you believe in the efficacy of the vaccine. There you go. Wow, we've run out of time. It's 2:26. Dr. Bombay, I hope you have a great weekend. I so appreciate you calling in every week, sir.
Thank you very much, Richard. You have a nice weekend.
Okay, very good. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.